Okay. Josh, we good? Thanks. Okay, good morning, everyone. Week 3. Before we start, however, I was a bit behind in the planning of this, but I can't change God's calendar. So Purim is this coming Tuesday. And as we always do, we do a Purim morning tea. So it's happening this coming Tuesday. And I'm going to push you all to try and come because Purim is such an important festival. Particularly this year. Why I say that is because one of the big themes of Purim is when the Purim story happened, it was a very, very low time for the Jewish people, and yet they were filled with faith and hope. And that's what we need to do as well nowadays, and now in this time especially. So it's really important to engage with the energy of Purim. So this Purim morning, we're doing a morning tea for women, as we always do in Vaucluse. This you see it's at the home of Kim Elster. There's a flyer here, but the address is not. So it's 16 the Crescent, Vaucluse, and it will be at 9:30 to 10:20. So it's a short, quick Megillah reading. Those of you who heard me read the Megillah, that means literally quick, and just we'll talk a little bit about Purim and the lessons. So please try and come along. This coming Tuesday morning.
Sorry, Rabbi.
Yes.
The number?
16 the Crescent. Okay. So just to review a little bit from last week. So last week we talked about the basis behind the concept of let them, which is the idea of power and control, that we all have a need to control, but really it's about controlling ourselves, not controlling others or other things or other people. And that includes giving up and letting go from the idea of defining ourselves by other people, doing everything to please other people, and being obsessed with the perception of others of ourselves, which gets us into trouble. So the bottom line is we understand that we cannot control other things and other people. We can inspire other people, as we explained last week, but we can't control them. So that's such a basis to the idea of the let them theory. We talked about freedom, and freedom, what that means, particularly from a Jewish perspective, that freedom, real freedom, must come with responsibility and purpose. Otherwise, we're just replacing one prison for another, the prison of other people to the prison of ourselves. So that's why we need to understand that it's about, and that's going to come through a lot today, because I said to you I was worried about the let me part of the formula, because I'm always nervous when we start talking about the idea of me, because there's so much out there today which is very self-absorbed and taking self-care to an extreme and all about us. Hence the course we once did called The Epidemic of Narcissism. But actually she does it really well, I have to say. We'll see when we get to the chapter of let me, that's actually it's done right. But we'll talk about it when we get there. So there is that concept, but it's about me making the right choice and taking responsibility. We talked also about the power of saying it, this power of sort of when you get upset about something or something that someone's done, to actually say the words let them or whatever you want to say that will help you is a good thing to do, because the power of speech is quite impactful, and therefore that's part of the idea. we went through last week the whole idea of how it came to her and where she used it, her initial thing about her friends making a party and she saw on Instagram and so on and so forth. So she used the idea of let them and letting go their control. And we added that from a Jewish perspective, of course, it's enhanced because when you talk about things meant to be, and maybe I wasn't meant to be there, and Hashgacha Pratit and so on, it makes it that much more easier. And as we said last week, which is going to be much more developed this week, the idea of actually sometimes also self-reflecting and being self-aware and maybe coming to the conclusion that there's part that I could do as well, I can contribute or I could have contributed. That's also part of the process, as we will see later. But the first part is I don't let what happened to me or what they said or what they did control me, take hold of me, live in me, ruminate in me, but it's more about let them and I let go of the control, which is the first stage to being free. Okay, so let's continue. So one of the things she says, before we get to the let me part, one of the things she talks about in the book is she explains the wisdom behind the theory. It's not just a gimmick, but actually there's a lot of wisdom behind this idea of let them. And interestingly enough, she obviously doesn't know that much about Judaism, but she talks, I don't know who she is, so I guess, but I'm guessing not. So she talks, the author of the book, Mel Robbins.
Robbins,
yeah. Because she says that the mindset or the theory that she's researched scientifically or seeing it if it's mirrored or copied by other models, she says it's very, very much, she discovered it's very much based in Stoicism or Buddhism or radical acceptance, detachment theory and so on. So for example, the idea of Stoicism is that the focus on controlling your own thoughts and actions, right? Not the thoughts and actions of others. Of course, which goes together with the idea of let them. The radical acceptance is the idea that suffering comes from resisting reality. In other words, the pain we feel stems from wishing things were different than they are. And that's a real problem. We know that, of course, right? And the let them theory, of course, helps you to accept the reality, but to detach from it. And then there's the idea of detachment theory, which is to emotionally distance ourselves from situations that trigger us. Now, of course, the reason why I said she doesn't know a lot about Judaism is obviously all these concepts are very ancient, long before all these theories, and they're very, very fundamental to Jewish thinking, of course, which is the idea that we don't control everything, we do accept reality because reality is something that happens, everything's divine, everything is divinely orchestrated and inspired, and therefore couldn't happen without God, and therefore the idea of our emotions controlling our feelings, all of those things, of course, are things we've talked about a lot, and they're all rooted a lot and fundamentally in Jewish thought.
Including detachment.
Okay, let me hear. That's an interesting question. Robin's asking, does that include detachment? So why wouldn't it be part of Judaism?
Because it's like stepping back and not.
Okay, so that's interesting. So I'll explain why in a second. Yeah. No, so yes, in the one hand, it is important to detach from something that's triggering you or something that's paining you, right? That's what I was going to say. So first of all, it is a Jewish idea, but in Judaism, we don't just detach. We do detach, but we don't just detach, right? And sort of give up and just continue without the situation that is causing us issues, right? The reason for that is as follows. And I think it's a very foundational concept. In Judaism, when we approach things that happen, right? In other words, we approach things that people say to us or people that did to us or circumstances that happen or circumstances that do happen that could cause us issues, create stress, create challenge, create problems. In Judaism, we don't just look for strategies, how to get out of it. It's not just about strategies. It's about what we call in Hebrew avodah. Everything that happens to us is part of our service to God, meaning part of doing good, part of living with values, right? Therefore, sometimes you can detach from something and maybe the strategy is effective, but you haven't applied your values properly. What I mean by that is, that anything that happens in this world, any circumstance that happens outside of us, which we cannot control, as we said, which is why it's good to let go and detach from it to a degree. But any pain that happens, even pain, unfortunately, any challenge, anything that happens to us, about us, around us, has a purpose. Nothing happens without a purpose. Now that's not, we've talked about this many times, but in the context of this discussion, it's not an easy thing to absorb. Because sometimes it's very hard to understand what would be the purpose of that happening. Right? So in other words, and it might be a purpose that we don't even want. And it's certainly a circumstance that we don't want. But it doesn't change the truth. The truth is that nothing happens without a purpose, because that is life. Life is about living with purpose and meaning, applying our values, our life values, our values that make us better people, our godly values, our spiritual values, all the values that were given to us over 3,000 years ago, which is part of the eternity of our heritage and who we are. Just parenthetically, I thought it was an unbelievable line. Did any of you hear Ron Dermer in the last week? He was unbelievably brilliant. One of the things he says, he talked about, he wished the new ambassador to Israel well, who was here. And he said that he was the ambassador to America, and he just doesn't recall meeting the ambassador of Babylon or the ambassador of ancient Rome, but he says the still ambassador of Israel, because it's the same Israel, same nation that was here 3,000 years ago. So we have eternal values, and those values are what gives us the ability to live with proper meaning, to live for a higher cause, to live to make ourselves better, the world a better place, and the world a more godly place. And part of that process is that anything that happens is part of that purpose. Because I think I shared with you last time that the Baal Shem Tov explained in the concept of Hashgacha Pratit, right, which we always talk about, that everything happens by divine providence, is not that everything happens by divine providence and it just happens, and whatever God had a reason to do it. It's much more than that. Anything that happens by Hashgacha Pratit happens because it's part of the overall puzzle of purpose of creation. Right? So therefore, anything that happens, yes, we can detach, and detach is a strategy, and it's probably a good strategy to begin with, because in order to make sure something does, or something or someone doesn't control us, we need to detach. But in Judaism it goes, there's a stage 2, which a little bit actually can be linked into the let me theory, which we'll talk about soon. So everything that happens, not just happens because God allowed it or made it happen, it has a purpose. And our job is, after we've detached, in whatever way, after we've made sure that no one controls us or nothing controls us, after we are ready then to take responsibility, as we will soon discuss, and reflect on it, we actually have to re-engage, but in a different way, as we'll soon speak about. But still, we do have to, we cannot ignore it, nothing. Because nothing happens by chance, and as the Rambam says, if something happens, there's a lesson, and there's a mechanism, an opportunity to channel it into some concept of purpose and meaning. Does that make sense? Yep, okay. And we know this from so many different things, even things that happen that are evil and wrong. King David once said, when King David was traveling back to Jerusalem and he was stopped by an adversary of his, a person called Shimi ben Gera, and he was obnoxious and he cursed the king. And King David said, don't do anything to him. He needs to take responsibility for what he did. He did the wrong thing. But in terms of what he did to me, I'm not going to punish him, because actually I need to view it as something that happened to me which has a purpose. And I need to work that through. And he didn't want to do it himself, because he had to learn a lesson from it, or he had to reflect on it. And later King Solomon dealt with him in the proper way. But that's the idea. Anything that happens, even silly things. You know, when we talk about the Baal Shem Tov emphasizing this idea of Hashgacha Pratit, there was once a story of the Baal Shem Tov talking to his students. He was giving a shiur, and they were very deeply involved in the learning and very focused, when suddenly there was a disturbance. Some handyman guy who was trying to advertise was knocking on the window. And he was knocking on the window and he was saying, anything to fix, anything to fix. And they were some of them were a little bit annoyed, like, you know, they're in the middle of an intense focus shiur or something, and they want to concentrate, and he was pestering them, and until one person said, no, nothing, no, you can go. And the guy persisted and he said, no, I'm sure you have something to fix. If you look hard, you'll find. And obviously that was more annoying. And the Baal Shem Tov stopped them all and he said, everything that happens has a lesson, has a purpose. Everything is b'shachar pratit. Do you know what this person just said? He just taught us an unbelievable thing. And sometimes as people, we think we have nothing to fix within ourselves, not the leak in the roof. But, right? And if you look hard, you'll find there is what to fix, even if you think there's nothing to fix. If you look hard, you'll find what to fix. That was the concept, right? But it does begin, if you're going to do this, it begins with your choice to find the purpose. And therefore, the first step really is about giving up control. And not letting other people consume you and not letting other people control you. So in other words, let them is a detachment, but it's going to, which will help you let go of the control. But the circumstance, the experience, you can't ignore. You can let go of it so it doesn't control you, but you can't ignore it because everything that happens for a purpose, and therefore you can later come back and reconnect to the purpose. So the detachment is part of Judaism, part one, but it's not the whole story. Okay. So let's also reflect on some other paragraphs that she writes before we get to the main topic, and that is like this. She says, the power that we take back, in other words, when you let go, especially when it's people. By the way, let them theory, it works with lots of things, and that's the rest of the book. She talks about the stresses in our lives, the things that happen at work, all these things which we'll talk about. But the example that she started with was this whole story with her friends, and that's our example a lot of the time. It's when people cause us stress because of what they've said or what they've done and so on. So we say let them, and what we really are doing is taking back control, right? So she says that while she was working, taking back control, and then we respond and we choose, and it's the power of our own response, right? And she said, while working on this book, I had the honor of sitting down with Martin Luther King, the third, and Andrea Waters King. Anyway, they were talking on a podcast, something, and then he said the following. He said that the let them theory represents a profound truth, which is a very good line. It's a very important line, actually, because we often forget that. Choosing peace is not a weakness, right? So choosing peace is not a weakness. By the way, men are very bad at this, just generally speaking. Just want to say, right? But we're talking to a group of women, so it might be easier. Right? No, because, you know why? Because it is a very, very big tendency, and I think particularly a masculine tendency, because you've got to show strength and all the rest of it, that sometimes choosing peace or being quiet is a weakness. By the way, it applies to other things also, like it applies to like areas of grief, like crying is a weakness, all these things, right? Which is not true. There are good things that are just not displays of strength, but they actually are real inner strength, right? Sometimes choosing vulnerability or choosing crying is actually a strength, not a weakness. But particularly in this context, making a choice not to lash out back at a person or not to create a conflict or not to inflame a conflict might seem like weakness, and maybe sometimes it is weakness because it's coming from the wrong decision, it's coming from the wrong place. But it actually is an amazing strength. It's self-control, as the Pirkei Avot says, we mentioned this last week, that who's a truly strong person who controls their temptation, controls their impulses. So it's a real concept, choosing peace, he says, is a real strength. But he says, and then he continues, he says, let them doesn't mean giving away control. It means reclaiming it. By choosing how we respond, by not feeling anger, hatred, or negativity, we exercise the ultimate power of ourselves. So this is the idea, right? Let them means I let them, I give up control, but I don't give up control completely. I take control and I make a choice, right? And the choice is one of great strength. In other words, not I keep the peace. Like there are people that just are wishy-washy, they never take a stand about anything because they don't want to be confrontational and therefore they don't want to make hard decisions. They're just giving in to everyone and everything. In other words, they're really letting other people and other things and circumstances of life control them, which is a terrible thing to do. Because it just gets them into trouble and gets them upset and it's deeply hurtful. What we're talking about here is different. What we're talking about here is choosing not to fight or choosing the peace or choosing to let it go as a strength, as a choice. In other words, it's not letting other people control me, it's my choice to do that. So they can do what they want, but I'm choosing not to create a conflict. I'm choosing not to create further pain. All right? And then he said, the true power lies in our response. And he says that my father believed that non-violence was not passive but the most courageous form of action, which is most of the time true. Choosing peace when the hatred tries to provoke. By refusing to react with bitterness, we reclaim our power and we shape a better future. The word choosing matters. You reclaim your power by choosing how to respond. The theory is a tool that helps you do it. Okay. And then she adds an interesting thing, and this is in the words, let them, this is the power of this theory, right? She said, I've had a lot of people ask me if let them is the same thing as letting go. She says it's not. Letting go feels like you've lost. You're surrendering to something beyond your control. Let them is the opposite, it's strength. Right? So this is the basis of what we're going to talk to. It's not about giving up control, it's about redirecting the control, rerouting the control. Like, is it going to control me, or am I going to control the situation with strength? Obviously, strength based on values and selflessness and kindness and compassion, as we'll talk soon. But that's the idea. So the idea is actually not just about giving up and, I always have to give in kind of things, as people sometimes say, but it's actually a choice. It's a choice that I don't give up control, I reroute the control, which is incredibly a Jewish idea. This is the idea we talked about, that everyone has a need to control, and control is a really important thing. Control is together with the idea of free choice. Free choice means I control myself. That's what free choice is. As we said, freedom is not to do what I want. Freedom is to choose what's right, which most of the time is very difficult. That's the truth. To live with values is difficult. To hold myself back, not to indulge in temptation and other terrible things is difficult. Because we are born with a Yetzer Hara and a Yetzer Tov, a good inclination, a bad inclination. So therefore it's rerouting the control to make proper choices. So, just to summarize it in different words a little bit, right? Because this is really, really a very, very powerful idea. Because like I said last week, and I said just before, it's the introduction to the let me part of the let them has to go afterwards into let me. Because when I say I won't control them and I won't let them control me, it has to be followed by what she's going to explain in the next chapter. I'm just summarizing as introduction and context with let me. And let me means not let me do what I want. Let me means let me take responsibility, as we spoke about last week. In other words, if I'm rerouting control and I say let them and I give up their control over me or its control over me, I then have to say let me take responsibility. Let me own the story, right? And that is, as we said last week, that's really what responsibility means, what freedom means, which is let me take control, let me take responsibility, so I can make sure to choose what's right. And again, from a Jewish perspective, what's right in the context of morality and meaning and purpose, right? Which also comes into the idea of not ignoring the situation. If we're talking about other people doing something to me, as it was in her story, we can't just ignore it. And we can't just say let them and I'm okay. Because actually, we learn in Jewish writings, we learn in Pirkei Avot, we learn in lots of other places, that we actually do have a responsibility to other people. We do not live in a vacuum, right? We don't live in isolation. I don't live to do whatever I want to do, even if it works for me or even if it's right for me, right? I live with other people and I have a responsibility to other people. We are connected to other people. We are responsible to other people. Particularly, you've heard this saying many times that all the speakers have been using these days, is the saying of the Talmud, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, all Jews are responsible for each other, especially when we have that deeper Jewish connection, that soul connection. We can't just ignore other people, and sometimes that means actually doing things that do please other people. I'm just showing a bit of a nuance to this whole process, right? And it sometimes means doing what pleases other people, even when we don't like to do it. But it might be the right thing to do because of a kindness. It might be the right thing to do because of compassion. It might be the right thing to do just because we don't have this luxury of just saying I do what I want and I couldn't care less what everyone else thinks. And it's actually wrong. What is right is I'm not bound by other people. I'm not defined by other people. And I don't do stupid things just because I don't want to upset someone else. Or I don't make myself a shmata because other people want me to be a shmata. No, that's correct. That's a weakness and that's wrong. But we do have a responsibility to other people. And we do have a responsibility to other people even to go out of our way for other people. That's part of Judaism. It's part of kindness. That I even do kindness when I don't like to do it. Right? But I own the story. I don't just ignore something and I don't become a victim to something. I don't blame them and I don't let them go either. I need them to reflect and from a position of strength to make a choice to do what is right. And what is right might be to consider the feelings of other people in this particular case. It might be not. You need to think it through. It depends. You've got to work out what the value is and you've got to work out what is consistent with those living, those life values. Right? Because there's so many values that are so important. First of all, we are responsible for each other. Second of all, we need to remember that peace is an extremely important Jewish value. Unity and peace. Shalom. Right? The very, very last Mishnah in the entire set of Mishnahs says that there's no greater vessel for blessing than peace. And peace, by the way, can be a conflict. Doesn't have to be a full-blown violent conflict. Conflict can be also a silent conflict, right? Where someone's upset with you. Now, sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. But if there is something you can do about it, without damaging you in a negative way, then we need to do something about it. That's why forgiveness is so important. That's why every night there's a prayer of forgiveness before we go to sleep. That's why making peace, and maybe before Yom Kippur, or whatever it is, we are taught in the Jewish code of law, the Shulchan Aruch, that we need to seek out those people we might have hurt and see if we can make up, right? So, for example, just because someone decides, I always tell you stories that work, right? I always remind you, because there's lots that didn't work. Many, many, many years ago, I did something which I don't regret at all. It was the right thing to do, but I upset someone in the course, right? Wrongly, I think, but so it was a kind of that. So it's that concept I'm talking about, right? So I didn't like the fact that he doesn't, and he stopped talking to me. Stop, cold, doesn't talk to me. Many, many years ago, this was like okay. So I decided, I'm not changing. I'm not going to give in because I was doing the right thing. Clearly, I mean, I consulted with others and whatever. So I decided that I'm going to just be nice to him. Right? Notwithstanding that I could have had a lot of complaints about what he did and how public, whatever. So every time I see him in the street, I'd wish him good morning, or for Shabbos, I wish him good Shabbos. He would totally ignore me. And without reading the book, I had this let them philosophy. If you want to ignore me, I'm doing the right thing. And time heals, and eventually I'm a very good friend of his today. And it worked, right? Why I do it? I didn't have to, because peace is a very important thing. Now, not always possible. There's peace and there's truth, and they both have to work together, and that's a whole other discussion. That's very, very complicated. It's a very, very complicated part of life. But you can't just ignore something, because there's values of not having conflict. There's values of responsibility. There's values of being responsible to other people and taking them into account, even if you don't like to. It's all about going beyond ourselves. It all goes back to the fundamental way of living, to get rid of our ego, or at least to minimize our ego, and to do for others, and to go beyond ourselves. Very hard thing to do. We often fail at that. That's fine. We're human beings. But that's the aspiration, right? That's the concept. And that's why this let them has to be followed by let me. Because you have to get to a point of strength where you take responsibility and say, okay, what am I doing about it now? And you need to match that up with what are your values. And if values are responsibility, consideration for others, peace, all these things, there are things you can do, but from a position of strength. By the way, responsibility has a lot to do, I can't help myself because obviously, I love the calendar. So responsibility has a lot to do with the idea of Purim story, right? Because responsibility also means not being a victim. It always means owning your story. This is the story of Purim fundamentally, because the story of Purim was that the Jews had something, and I think this also has relevance today, by the way. Purim has a story of when Haman got Achashverosh, the king, to make a decree against the Jewish people. They were in grave danger, right? They could have just blamed it on everyone else, and only tried to get those people who they thought was responsible to take responsibility, as we do today sometimes also. We also tend to do that, right? It's all the police's fault, it's all the government's fault, it's all the police's fault, this one's fault, that one's fault. And all of that might be true, but that's not the point. The Jews didn't do that, and particularly Esther. When Mordechai came to Esther and said, you got to go to the king and intercede, she says, no, I will go, but everyone has to take responsibility first. Look at themselves, reflect. How's their connection with God been? How's the relationship with God, with their own Jewishness? What brought them to assimilate into Achashverosh's party? All this kind of stuff. And she said, I'm going to go to the king. If everyone fasts and prays and does something and learns and cries out to God for 3 days before, and then I'll go. Because everyone has to take responsibility first. And then obviously you've got to do what you can. But every story, the Rambam says this, nothing, you can't look at anything and just say it just happened. You've always got to respond yourself, not by telling everyone else how they have to respond, but we all have to respond ourselves. Same sort of idea. Which, unpacking this now, comes to the next part of the book's work, in other words, the chapter. Right? And she talks about lots of different ways of how it all works. This can happen at work. So stage one, we say, is let them. So for example, it's about having the sense of self-esteem almost, and security, or not insecurity at least. So she gives an example. Let's say you're in a meeting at work and you come up with an idea and everyone just tends to ignore it because someone else spoke louder and gave a different idea, and everyone goes to their idea. So that can be very hurtful. Let them is a great way to say, let them, we're good, right? It can be in dating, it can be in relationships, it can be in all kinds of things that you can take as very, very hurtful. And she says, well, take me on my situation in the couch. I wasn't even aware that my friends had gone away together. The second I saw the photos from their trip, though, I reacted. My emotions took over. I felt insecure. I felt left out. I felt less than, right? And then I took it a step further and told myself that I had done something wrong, which only made me feel worse, right? So that's I've done something wrong from a weakness. In other words, it's all my fault. That's also another way of, right? The sad truth is, I did this to myself. My friends didn't do anything to me. They were just living their lives. They're allowed to go away together. They're allowed to plan a weekend with whomever they want. The way I reacted to the trip is what hurt me, right? So then what she does is, and if you refer to the sketches on your handout, she talks, so obviously her first response and what got her going and what released her negative emotions and what gave her relief was let them. Okay, let them. So I'm letting go. Without let them, have a look at number A. So you have all these terrible emotions, inferior, jealousy, insecure, left out, less than, and so all the hurtful feelings, right? So let them, it's their problem, not mine. However, before we get to however, she says, when you say let them, you free yourself from the weight of all the negativity that just made you sink. It's like pushing off the ground on a seesaw, right? So that's the thing. You go up, and your friends on the other side go down. The power of dynamic shifts, which is number B, which shows you on the top. But the problem is this, right? The problem is that that's detachment. And that detachment has a certain sense of superiority. Let them. I'm on top. Let them. Now it's a kind of an important stage because you have to let go before you can re-engage, right? But you kind of, the problem with the let them, and this is where we're going to the let me, right? And this is sort of the main point I wanted to drive today, really, is the problem with the let me, actually says herself, it's a very, very good chapter, this, right? That it feels so good, she says, to rise above other people and the situation that bother you, and now you feel a sense of superiority and confidence, and you push through all the negative emotions, and you rise up and you feel great, and it's going to make you feel better, and better than someone else, right? You'll feel wiser and weirdly sort of above it all. And she says a little superiority can go a long way when you're in an emotional spiral. The temporary feeling of power over people can help you move through the situation, accept what's happening, and process the frustrating or painful experiences in life. It helps you to feel better. And then it's all over. And then what? So what do you do with it all? Right? So it's actually so she says, then you'll think, now what? You'll be sitting up there looking down at other people. And by the way, part of looking down at other people, as she puts it next to that second sketch, is judgment. In other words, yeah, I'm okay, I've let them. It's their problem, they were bad, they were doing the wrong thing. So what you've done is, you've gone from not letting people control you to feeling better than them, superior to them, because you've let go, and even judging them. So I didn't do anything wrong, I'm a great person, they all should have invited me. It was very, very wrong I didn't, but I've let go of all those emotions, which is great. But you've also put yourself on the top of the seesaw, looking down on other people, right? Now again, from a Jewish perspective, that's a problem, right? Because we have a responsibility to other people. We are charged with being humble, not superior, right? Humble means, by the way, humility means, as Moshe Rabbeinu said, it says in the Torah with regard to Moses, that Moses was the most humble person upon this earth. And it doesn't mean that he felt he didn't know his greatness. He was the greatest prophet, he was the greatest righteous person, but he nevertheless felt that even if there was someone that was zillions of levels lower than him, he still felt humble because he felt maybe that person is trying harder than I'm trying. Maybe that person, if he had my capabilities or my opportunities, would be better than me, right? Feeling superior to other people or anyone. The Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe in the book of Tanya, talks about it. It's one chapter where he talks about humility, and he quotes and he emphasizes that it says you shall be humble. It says in Pirkei Avot, shval ruach, you should feel low, not low in a negative sense, but more humble. Bifnei kol adam, before every person. And he unpacks it and he extends it and he says, what does that mean for every person? But clearly, I'm doing things that are better than what other people are doing. I mean, maybe. But he says, you know what? But you don't have the other person's tests. And how do you know what someone else would do? And if you were in the other person's situation, how do you know how you would act? Right? So it's not good just to get on the seesaw and say, okay, let them, they can do what I want. Because you haven't really let go of them, because you're still judging them. You're still looking down on them. How do you know what you would be in that situation? We are all children of God. We're all created by God. We're all created in the image of God. So humility doesn't work with just saying let them. And this is her point, and it's a very good point. Quite refreshing, actually, because it's a little bit of a deviation from some of the more modern self-serving stuff, right? And that's why she says, you've got to go to the next stage. And next stage is let me. Right? She says, I'll just read this to you because she says it well, right? She says like this, and that's exactly what the old me would have done with the situation on the couch. If I had just stopped at the let them part, I imagine it now, I would have sat there in my superiority, I wouldn't have reached out, I would have gossiped about them behind their backs, sought out reassurance from other friends, felt very awkward every time I saw them, and these are women that I actually like and want to be friends with. Or I took it a little bit deeper from a Jewish perspective, not just I want to be friends with them, even if I don't want to be friends with them. I still have to be humble, and I still have to be at peace with them, and I still have to be kind to them, and I still have a responsibility to them, right? It's part of our values, it's part of living together. So, and she says, there's a question, how exactly is feeling morally superior going to help you create those great friendships? It's not. Or connections, or humility, or whatever the case is. And she says, as your friend, I feel obligated to warn you that if all you do is say let them, you're going to find yourself without a lot of friends, without a lot of social plans. I'm confused as to why the theory isn't working in your favor. Which brings me to the major discovery that I made when I first started researching the theory. Let them is just the first half of the equation. You can't stop there. You have to go to the second half, which is let me. And what is let me? So she explains, let me is taking responsibility. As I said, shifting the control back to you and taking responsibility. So what am I going to do about it now? Right? What am I going to do about it next? And she says, what I love about let me is it immediately shows you what you can control. And there's so much you could. Your attitude, your behavior, your values, your needs, your desires, and what you want to do in response to what just happened. Which, by the way, is true freedom. If you just go back to the other thing, if you just stay with the let me, I think I've shared this with you before. I've spoken to people that, that they claim that they've done let them. I mean, not the words, because they didn't read the book yet. But they're okay, I'm okay. Like, I don't talk to that person because they're just junk, and they did something to me 20 years ago, which is really terrible. But I'm okay, I just don't talk to them. In other words, not only are you superior, but you're actually still controlled by them, right? In other words, you're not fully in control. You've given up control and you're doing what you want, but actually you're still somewhat defined by them, right? If you think about it. It's not just about value, it's also about control. You're still controlled by them. The fact that you don't talk to that person, which means you can't talk to that person, means that they still affect you, right? The fact that you feel the need to gossip about them or to tell someone else how evil they were and judge them means you're still somewhat controlled by them, right? So therefore, it's not about superiority at all. It's about letting go of control. She calls it balance. I actually don't like the balance. Like she says, balance between being superior and taking responsibility. I don't think it's about balance. I think it's just about being moral, right? Not being weak. It's about being strong. Not being strong means I don't let them control me, so I've given up that control. But it also means I control the situation and I control my responses to do what's right and to do what's purposeful, right? And what she did was actually amazing, I have to say, right? Which is the third drawing there, right? So it's acceptance. First of all, you accept the reality, you understand. You start to have compassion, very important. You start to say, actually, I need to judge them favorably. And if they did something really wrong, actually I have to feel bad for them. We shouldn't judge people and be negative to people who do something wrong, even if the wrong is to us. We actually have to feel bad for them. We have to take responsibility, we have to take true control. And therefore, she started a journey in that particular story, right? Where she says, no one really owes me anything, for number one. No one owes me a call, no one owes me an invitation. And she said, after I thought about it and being honest with myself, have I been doing my part? And when I started to think about it, the answer was no, right? Like, let me take responsibility a little bit for what happened. And she did. She said, well, I haven't really engaged with them. I've been busy with so many things. I haven't contacted them. I haven't reached out to any of them really lately. I mean, we're officially friends, but I haven't really done anything for that. We know friendship is a two-way street, right? Giving and taking. So she knows I need to now make time for friendship. Let me develop better boundaries with work so I can make time for friendship. Let me prioritize my social life because it clearly matters to me. And it's my responsibility to create that if I want it to happen, right? And she realized that. There's another unbelievable saying that Baal Shem Tov used to emphasize. It comes from earlier writings. It says, "Kol hapasel b'mamo pasel," which means very, very often when we criticize other people, we actually have the same weakness. We just have to reflect it inwards and see, well, how well am I doing in that sphere, right? Do I reach out to people? Did I include everyone all the time? So it becomes an opportunity to learn, it becomes an opportunity to improve. But this time, it's not through pain, it's not through hurt. It's not through putting yourself down, it's just by there's a big difference. There's a big difference between putting yourself down and taking responsibility. Responsibility is a strength, putting yourself down is a weakness. Which goes back to what I shared with you many, many years ago, and that is the concept of guilt. There's bad guilt and there's very, very good guilt. Bad guilt means that the guilt controls you because you're putting yourself down, you're weak, you're insecure, and therefore you just knock yourself down at any given time. Some of those things you knock yourself down about might be correct, some of them might not be correct, but it doesn't come from a strength, and therefore it's not helpful, it's destructive, and probably half the time wrong anyway. Because you just keep putting yourself down and making yourself lower and lower. So either you're aggressive to others or you put yourself down, they're both bad. Right? But when you let go of the toxicity, let go of the fact that they've hurt me, that's first stage. So let them is a very, very important stage. I'm not going to be bound by them, I'm not going to be ruled by them, I'm not going to be controlled by them, my emotions are not going to be controlled by them, but I am going to say let me take control. So me control, first of all, whatever happened was supposed to happen. Me control means I'm not going to feel resentful, I'm not going to feel superior, I'm actually going to not let it bother me, but at the same time I'm actually going to reflect. At the time that I choose, at the time with a clear head, when I'm calm, when I'm not feeling, not by beating myself down, but by taking responsibility, showing the strength. It's actually a good feeling. It's not like guilt, which controls you, it's a bad thing. But you control the guilt. In other words, because sometimes to grow we need to feel uncomfortable. Sometimes to grow we need to confront hard truths about ourselves. But from with a clear head, or with someone else that we can talk to. Reflect it through. Maybe some of the things I did is okay, but some of the things I did is not okay. Because sometimes things are other people's fault. That's fine, right? And then she doesn't do this, but it goes further than that, right? It goes further than that. Let's say I do reflect. Let's say someone has hurt me. I want to play this out in a different scenario. So in her scenario, she reflected and she realized, well, I haven't been so great either. So I need to take responsibility. I need to start reaching out. And that was the let me, and that was good responsibility. But it's actually more than that. From a Jewish perspective, it's much more than that. From a Jewish perspective, it's even if I do reflect with a clear head, objectively and honestly, brutally honestly, right? And then I come to the conclusion that actually I didn't do anything wrong. Actually, I haven't contributed. And that happens sometimes. There are people that do things that are just totally wrong, and sometimes maybe I could have done a little bit better and all that kind of stuff, but maybe it's actually the other person's fault. It really is. It could be. But you've got to be very careful before that's a hard thing. We're subjective, so it's a hard thing to come to that conclusion. But let's say we do, right? Even then, and maybe this is uniquely Jewish, I don't know, but even then, we have to have compassion for them. We might disagree with them, we might vehemently disagree with them, that's fine, but we still have to be respectful to every human being, we still have to be respectful. I mean, there are people that are pure evil, I know I always get that question afterwards, but I'm talking about normal stuff, right? And we have to be kind to them. So I always go back in these things to, we always find different details in the story, right? Because it's just a powerful, powerful story. The story of Yosef, Joseph in Egypt, right? We had every reason to be a victim and every reason to be hurt by his brothers. And he freely forgave them because, number one, it was deeper than just, I'm going to take responsibility. It was more than that. It was God's plan. At the end of the day, you did what you did and it was wrong and you're responsible between you and God. But it was God's plan and the plan was to come to Egypt. But you know, when the brothers first came to Egypt, I want you to listen to this part of the Midrash. It's unbelievable. When the brothers first came down to Egypt and he recognized them and they didn't recognize him, he sent them back to Yaakov and he says to bring the youngest brother, Binyamin, which they didn't want to bring. He then said, I'm going to hold one of you here. Well, it seemed like I'm going to hold one of you prisoner here so that you're guaranteed to come back and you'll bring back Binyamin. Who was that one brother that he held back? It was Shimon. Shimon, he was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, right? And Shimon was the one who hated him the most. So on the surface, Shimon thought he's in big trouble there. Well, he didn't know it was Yosef, but it looked like someone's detaining him. And if he would have known the situation, he would be really, really petrified if he would know it was Yosef, because he'd think, I was really bad to him. Because the Midrash tells us that when they threw Joseph into the pit, Shimon was the one to come and add extra, and he threw boulders, he threw stones after him. Right? And Yosef keeps him, and they go back, and they're worried, and they go back to convince Yaakov to send Binyamin, the youngest son, which they do at the end, and they all come together, and that's when Yosef reveals himself to them. And the Midrash says that Yosef took Shimon, and he gave him the best time of his life for the next few days, until the brothers came back. He gave him parties, he gave him presents, he gave him everything, right? Because he felt compassion for him. He felt he needed to bestow kindness to him. That's a stronger thing, right? In other words, it's reaching out to people, maybe not at the level of Joseph, but it's reaching out to people, not necessarily to become their best friend, but to show kindness to them, right? To show kindness either to someone you don't even know or someone you don't like, right? That's part of the let me, but from a strength. It's a choice. It's real self-control. Someone who really, and by the way, that's not a contradiction to holding people accountable, and it's not a contradiction to standing up for your rights sometimes. That's all okay, right? I had a story a couple of years ago. Someone asked me a question. It was an interesting question. Someone had a real financial dispute with someone. Right? But it's a person who asks me questions. He seeks guidance from me once in a while. And I thought he was just amazing, his approach. And he asked me, it was people have, unfortunately, money is one of the things that send people into tremendous, tremendous dispute. And he understood, perhaps correctly, I don't know, that the other person owed him a lot of money. Right? And he was very, very upset, obviously. But he's a very, very special human being. And they would daven in the same shul. He never fought with him. He always was respectful of him. He wished him good Shabbos. If he had a simcha in shul, he made a kiddush or something for a simcha, he didn't want that person to be excluded. But he said the guy owes him money. So what am I supposed to do? I mean, I could be nice to him, but he owes him money, right? And he's very convinced he owes him money. That's okay. I mean, there is one, when people have a financial dispute, one person's wrong, one person's right, generally speaking, right? We just don't know, right? So let's say he was right. So I said, well, there's a mechanism. If you both are observant and you both respect the process, you can do something called a din Torah, which is you can take him to a Beth Din. If he doesn't want to go, you can go to court. I mean, right? He says, yeah, but how does that work? So I explained to him, two things are mutually exclusive. And this is things that people find so hard to get around the head, to get the head around, right? I said, you're not obligated to let someone steal $20,000 from you or $1 million from you. If you believe the person owes you money, you should demand it. But actually, you can do it respectfully. You don't have to fight with him and his family in the process. You can say, look, I really believe that you owe me. This is the thing. We're going to resolve this. And I'm going to call you either to a Beth Din or to court, whichever one is applicable and appropriate. And I'm going to go retrieve that money. You see what I'm saying? Because it doesn't mean the other person's right. It doesn't mean you have to give in to the other person. It doesn't mean you have to let the other person go. Especially for something very significant. Sometimes it's something you have to have a conversation with other people, and you have to make sure, if it's a big thing, sometimes small things you can let go, but if it's a big thing, there's nothing wrong, nothing immoral, there's nothing inappropriate about being strong and making sure that you are protected. But you can still have compassion for the person. You don't know what you would do in his such circumstance. You don't know how you would respond. You still have a connection with him. You both still have the same connected souls. So yes, you could wish the person good Shabbos at the same time, and you can mean it. And you could not insist that he has to go away from your kiddush if you're making it in shul, because he's another person. He can be there, right?
And if you only half minute?
If you only what?
Half minute.
If you only half minutes, there's a wonderful Yiddish expression, and this goes to the power of peace and unity. The Yiddish expression says, "Sis besser a falsche shalom via emes hamachlekas," which means a false peace is much better than a real conflict. Right? That's why it's unbelievable. That's why we have in the Talmud the unbelievable disdain for lying, for dishonesty. It's one of the most greatest morals and values in Judaism. You say the signet ring of God is peace, and yet you're allowed to lie to create peace. Right? Or like another good Yiddish expression, that you're not allowed to lie. I'll say in English, you're not allowed to lie, but you don't always have to say the whole truth. Like, I'm an honest person. I gotta let the person. I gotta let him know where I stand. Maybe not. You have to. Is it going to achieve something? Is it going to achieve better unity? Is it going to achieve a better world? No. So you keep quiet. So yeah. So if you only half minute, it's also good, right? And that's the power. And that's why I was really pleased when I read this chapter, because it's actually the power of this let me. Let them is only half the picture. You have to then it's only a way of rerouting the responsibility rerouting the control to yourself, taking control, and then doing what's right. Now, what's right might be not full peace. What's right, there are relationships that have to be broken off. There are sometimes toxic relationships you have to, it's about doing. It's not about being nice to the person. It's about doing what is right. And what right might be being nice to the person. What right might be cutting off with the person. What's right might be creating boundaries that you partially engage with the person. We've talked about this many times. But it's about, let me reflect. Number one, do I have anything to do with this? Is something I should be doing different? And even if not, which she doesn't talk about so much, but it's even if not, what's still the right thing? What's the right way? That's why it was so beautiful about that story, because the person just wanted to know, tell me what the right thing to do is. Right? And I said, the right thing to do is, you think you own a large sum of money, well then deal with it. But at the same time, doesn't mean you have to be nasty to the person. You can do two things at the same time. Why? Because when you can do two contradictory things at the same time almost, is because right combines opposites. And two things can be true at the same time. And we can do both. That's the power. That's the power of holding two emotions at the same time, the power of doing two things at the same time, and it's the power sometimes of relating to someone else in two opposite ways, because it's the right thing to do. All coming from the let me take responsibility, not be controlled by the other, but choose to do the right thing. In the next weeks, we're going to talk about all different scenarios that this plays out into, which she goes through in the rest of the book. Again, a reminder, this coming Tuesday morning is Purim. Please come to 16 the Crescent, 9:30, quick Megillah reading and a bit of Purim spirit. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm away next week.
Next Thursday.
And Tuesday.
Oh, she's also okay.
Okay.
Are you going to Melbourne?
Pardon?
Going to Melbourne again?
No, I'm actually going to Queensland.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe you find the Queen's